I love this country. Britain is a patriotic, liberal, democratic society. Now our democracy itself is a target. There are forces here at home trying to tear us apart.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. This week we're looking at Britain's Prime Minister, who is warning that the country's democracy is being attacked and that elements within British society are trying to destroy the country. What does he mean by that? And is there any evidence?
In recent weeks and months, we have seen a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality. What started as protests on our streets has descended into intimidation, threats, and planned acts of violence.
The Prime Minister was referring to the pro-Palestine protests which have been going on in Britain's capital and elsewhere for the past 5 months. He says he has no problem with them per se, only certain elements.
What do we want? When do we want it? And if we don't get it?
Yes, you can march and protest with passion. You can demand the protection of civilian life. But no, you cannot call for violent jihad.
You are shocked to your core at the inaction of your government. Hang on to your anger.
There is no context in which it can be acceptable to beam anti-Semitic tropes onto Big Ben in the middle of a vote on Israel-Gaza. And there can be no cause that you can use to justify the support of a prescribed terrorist group like Hamas.
Thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people protest, usually peacefully. But a handful have been arrested and an even smaller number have been convicted under the UK's terrorism laws.
3 women have been found guilty at Westminster Magistrates Court of a terror offence after they displayed images of paragliders at a pro-Palestine march in central London last year.
Now our democracy itself is a target. Council meetings and local events have been stormed.
Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
MPs do not feel safe in their homes.
Pro-Palestine protesters have targeted a Conservative MP's family home, accusing him of being complicit in genocide.
Our MPs are our voice. So if they fail to air the voice that we've given them and the position which we've given them, as long as it's done respectfully, then they should know that that the people that they voted, who voted for them, are upset with them.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
Long-standing parliamentary conventions have been upended because of safety concerns.
We can't have a situation where we're changing the rules in the House of Commons and MPs are voting differently to how they otherwise might because of a baying mob. I mean, that's the end of democracy.
What message does it send to dictators and enemies of this country around the world?
And now the British government is going to spend an additional $40 million of taxpayers' money to protect MPs.
There are real threats, and actually I don't think there would be these concerns if these threats weren't genuine.
Well, we know they're genuine because there have been murders, as simple as that.
Murders, including of the MP Sir David Amess, a father of 5 stabbed to death by a Daesh sympathiser in 2021, apparently because of his stance on Syria. 5 years earlier, MP Joe Cox was murdered, shot and stabbed by a man with far-right views.
Islamist extremists and the far right feed off and embolden each other. They are equally desperate to pretend that their violence is somehow justified.
The return of the left-winger George Galloway to Parliament, having just won a by-election in Rochdale in the north of England, is also a worry for the Prime Minister.
The Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October the 7th, who glorifies Hezbollah and is endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the BNP.
Do you not respect the Prime Minister?
Do I respect the Prime Minister? I despise the Prime Minister.
What is objectionable about people being free between our river and sea?
Jewish people think it's intimidatory, and they think it's
not the Jewish people. Not the Jewish people on the demonstrations for Gaza. chanting it, some Jewish people.
Galloway's critics say the Rochdale election was rigged because rival candidates like Simon Danczuk of the anti-EU Reform Party were too intimidated to campaign properly. In Danczuk's case, there seems to be video evidence.
This bold white devil, look up, vote for Rochdale now, guys. You son. If you guys ever see this bold, I'm gonna put one in his head.
This by-election and the results should act as a serious wake-up call to those in power, and indeed the entire electorate. We're supposed to be a beacon of democracy. This shameful contest has been more characteristic of a failed state.
So, is Britain's democracy at risk? Coming up on the programme. London's police are too woke to handle the protest, says a former Scotland Yard detective.
Pseudo-intellectual claptrap, which has no place in policing.
We'll also be hearing from a former MP whose good friend, Sir David Amess, was murdered.
There's definitely a mood of concern for personal safety of politicians, which didn't exist when I was a Member of Parliament.
But first, let's hear from our guest, the journalist Thomas Fazi and the former British government advisor, Claire Pearsall. Welcome, both of you. Claire, why does the Prime Minister come out on a Friday afternoon and make an emergency speech in the way he did? Is there any merit to the warnings he's giving the British public about British democracy being at risk?
No, I don't disagree with the words that the Prime Minister used when he stood in Downing Street, but I don't think it needed to have been said on a Friday afternoon at 6:15 in the evening. It sent a lot of hairs running amongst the British media and British parliamentarians who thought that there may be an election called at the same time. The substance of his speech, I think, is very important, but it did feel a little grandstanding to hold it in Downing Street on a Friday night.
Well, Thomas Fazi, do you think there were political reasons for it, or do you think the Prime Minister was genuine in his concerns that he expressed over the 11 minutes on Friday?
Well, look, I mean, I agree that there's a very grave threat to democracy in the UK. I just don't think that the threat is coming from Galloway or from the hundreds of thousands of people that have been peacefully demonstrating for a ceasefire these months. I think the threat to democracy comes from billionaire oligarchs like Sunak himself and his corporate buddies. They are the ones that have hijacked democracy. They are the ones that are cracking down on free speech, that are implementing censorship, that are banning the right to protest. They are the ones that are supporting a what many would consider a genocidal campaign in Gaza. They are the ones that are pushing us into a war against Russia, a nuclear-powered country with not even a hint of a democratic debate. So I think this is what is dangerous for democracy. And this hysterical reaction, the fact that you would call a speech just to react to what would otherwise have been considered a rather uninfluential by-election is a sign of just how averse to democracy they are. From their perspective, democracy is okay so long as they can control the outcome of the process, which most of the time they succeed in doing. What happened in Rochdale was that an independent candidate who's not part of the establishment slipped through the cracks. And this is unacceptable to them. And I think this shows how they view democracy, how averse they are to democracy. And I think it simply drives home the point that they are the real danger to democracy. And I hope to see them gone as soon as possible.
Claire, Thomas is saying the real threat to democracy is Rishi Sunak and his type.
No, I don't believe that to be the case. And I do have concerns that reducing people's ability to protest. I think that we are very fortunate in the United Kingdom to have the right to protest, whether I agree with it or not. So I don't think that it is necessarily the government. I do think that perhaps the establishment were a little worried about the result in Rochdale, but it was a democratic and fair election. The result was that George Galloway was duly elected the Member of Parliament. So we have to accept that. What we cannot accept is people using free speech to incite any kind of hatred. I'm not suggesting for one second that that has happened with George Galloway, but some of his comments in the past have been inflammatory, and nobody wants to see communities put at war against each other. That is not right. I think the majority of people marching on the streets of London are there for peaceful reasons. But as with any protest, you will always have a small minority of individuals who are out there to cause grief, they are out there to cause trouble, and they are out there to say what is on their mind, not thinking of the risks to others. And I think that that has happened in previous marches. It is not just currently with the situation in Gaza and with Israel. So I think that we need to be incredibly careful of just suggesting it's one group of people.
Thomas, is Parliament being intimidated?
Again, I mean, this is just I mean, it's a completely hysterical reaction. And I mean, how scared of democracy must you be if you're afraid of one speaker coming into Parliament with a position that's different from that of the establishment and of the two major parties, or what you might call the uni-party, because of course one of the striking features of the current political British landscape is that the two major parties are almost indistinguishable on all major economic and foreign policy issues. First and foremost, Gaza. Again, this is the real problem. I mean, if you're worried about one man entering Parliament with an opinion that differs from that of the establishment, then I think, you know, that there's a lot to be concerned about the state of British democracy. And Galloway isn't representing some extremist stance, as Sunak implied. Galloway's pro-ceasefire and anti-war stance is shared by a majority of Britons. The latest polls tell us that close to 70% of Britons want a ceasefire. So this is not an extremist position. It's certainly not a violent position. The violent extremist position, I would say, is represented by the government, which is supporting a genocide in Gaza while pushing us towards war with Russia. I find that much more extremist and dangerous.
Just a little footnote on the Galloway victory. The allegations, and you'll see them particularly on the sort of conservative right-wing GB News network made by Nigel Farage and Richard Tice of Reform, are that the postal voting was subverted because people were following the vans and then intimidating the recipients of those votes to vote in the way they want, that postal boxes were being opened, only to find that 95% of the votes were for George Galloway, which they felt was a bit unusual. There was apparently intimidation and death threats against the Reform candidate, Simon Danchuk, and that turnout was incredibly low historically. Anyway, it seems that, you know, his victory has been accepted. He did go into Parliament, Claire. But you tell me, you speak to a lot of MPs and people around Westminster. Is there a feeling of intimidation?
Yes, there is. Now, this is not new. It is not solely related to the current conflict in the Middle East. It's been over a number of issues. And I think it's really important to note that MPs are receiving death threats. Some really quite violent acts are being wished upon them and their families. And that should never be acceptable in a democracy. It doesn't matter where the threats have come from. It shouldn't be allowed. And I think it is putting an awful lot of people off of entering politics to begin with, which has got to be bad for democracy. Now, I don't think you can lay it at the door of one particular group of individuals. This comes from a number of areas, whether it be regarding the COVID pandemic, whether it be regarding Brexit, or whether it is to do with the Middle East. You will always find those individuals who will put these threats to MPs, and especially female MPs.
Claire Pearsall and Thomas Fazi, thank you both very much. Well, as we've heard, the British government is going to be spending another $40 million of taxpayers' money on protecting MPs as a result of recent threats. A former MP whose friend David Amess was murdered in 2021 has told Nexus that politicians are right to be worried.
It's as if some kind of a relationship boundary has been breached between the dangerous members of the public and politicians. I would say that they're looking in the wrong place for the solution. The right place is to recognise that when politicians run each other down, when they undermine respect for each other, then the public takes their cue from that. The second thing they need to recognise is that some of this is an act of frustration against foreign policy, for example, and sometimes UK policies that invigorates people to make criminal acts. Ironically, it's this second one which is more difficult to resolve, because you can't make policy on the basis of intimidation by the public.
Well, some MPs say protests outside of their homes is a form of intimidation. This was outside the house of Tobias Ellwood, who avoided going home with his family after being warned by police. Police kept an eye on the about 60 demonstrators to make sure they stayed within the law. Mr. Ellwood told journalists that MPs should not be targeted in this way.
All MPs expect criticism. From time to time, it comes with the territory. But the bar of acceptable treatment is falling. You know, holding rallies outside of Parliament, outside an MP's office is one thing, but advertising the private address to mobilise an aggressive, intimidating rally at an MP's residential property, impacting not just on the family, but also neighbours as well, for me is a step too far.
So have the police been doing a good job of handling the massive protests, or have they failed to do their duty?
This week, I've met with senior police officers and made clear it is the public's expectation that they will not merely manage these protests, but police them. And I say this to the police: we will back you when you take action.
Well, it's time to get the thoughts of two former members of the Metropolitan Police Force. I'm joined by Peter Bleksley, who was a detective, and Leroy Logan, a former superintendent. Both men had decades of service under their belt. Peter, if I could start with you. So the Prime Minister is saying that he wants the police to police the protests and not just manage them. What do you think he means by that?
I think he'd like to see more robust action taken against people who clearly break the law during the course of these protests. And many people are absolutely aghast at the lack of police action when the law is clearly being broken. We have a Metropolitan Police which is far too fluffy and seems to get blown around in the wind and allow rampant, obvious, overt law breaking and refuse to do anything about it, which has given birth to the expression two-tier policing, because they are so inconsistent, and has caused huge disquiet amongst millions of members of the public.
Leroy, that description of what's been happening, does that chime with you?
Yes, unfortunately it does, because we are seeing police being very robust with certain like football gatherings and public order in that way. But we don't see the same form of strong policing, firm but fair policing with these protests.
The general argument has been that the protests have been overwhelmingly peaceful, and there hasn't been enough trouble there really worth mentioning, Peter.
I will not argue with the fact that a majority of people are there to peacefully protest, but the fact of the matter is some are not. And when there is not robust action against those people, then of course the public get deeply, deeply troubled.
I mean, the strength of feeling, Leroy, on the streets, you can see it almost every weekend. That comes from seeing tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza being killed within, say, 4 or 5 months. And the vast majority of those people have that in mind when they're showing their presence on the streets. However, the Prime Minister has been talking about MPs being scared for their lives, receiving death threats, and some protests at their homes. In the case of Tobias Ellwood, the police actually attended the protest and they didn't argue with the protesters who said what we're doing is legal. So that presumably is going to be allowed to carry on?
Well, from what I've been led to believe, that there's certain things that they're doing is definitely subject to irregularities and illegal, like putting, certain comments on Big Ben or the Elizabeth Tower. So, these are the sort of things that it's not only what they're doing, but what's the reaction? What can happen if it's going to cause unrest or is seen to be aggravating circumstances with the law? Then that can be quite subjective, and what's okay with some people is not okay with others. So I think there's definitely a consistent agreement with the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, because these are the sort of things they have to put to the CPS if someone is arrested and charged, because I think there seems to be a gap between the two. And I think we all will agree that the loss of life on both sides is very unfortunate, and we don't want to see people dying on both sides, and we want to see a peaceful process over in Gaza and Palestine. But at the same time, people have to know the law of the land here, what is appropriate and what isn't, and the police are supposed to act accordingly.
Peter Bleksley, a phrase you used earlier in the programme, two-tier policing, has turned out to be extremely controversial. It was used by the former Home Secretary and others, and it really runs the Metropolitan Police down. It's basically saying that they're not professional anymore. Are you saying that is your conclusion as well?
It is very easy to see when the Metropolitan Police are so consistently inconsistent, why people think this is the current situation, and that the police will deal with one group of people in a particular way and another group of people particularly in a completely different way. And the Prime Minister's words bore that out when he said they don't want these protests managed, they want them policed. And the previous week, the Home Affairs Committee, so Parliament's own committee, also said that these protests need to be policed without fear or favour, and that the policing of 20 people should be the same as the policing of 20,000 people. So the criticism goes beyond the Prime Minister to the Home Affairs Committee and to many millions of members of the public.
Peter Bleksley, just one last question for you. You were in the force for a very long time, and you've seen the changes over the decades. What was the turning point for you where they became a police force and more, well, you can describe them in your own words?
Well, it's now a social service rather than a police force. And the rot set in about 25 years ago when all of those police officers who wanted to become chiefs and sit at the very top of policing, climbing the promotion pole, went off to university, some of them to Oxford and Cambridge and other illustrious places of learning, and they came back to policing, which in its concept is a simple thing, and they came back with their heads full of pseudo-intellectual claptrap, which has no place in policing, and ever since then it's become fluffy, liberal, woke, fundamentally failing in its core purpose, and unfortunately all the people of Britain pay the price for that.
Can I just come in there just to say that I think that's a bit of a simplistic view on how policing has moved on from a force, because I was on the receiving end of the Metropolitan Police Force in the 60s and 70s with the sus law, and how we were heavy-handed policing that caused all sorts of unrest, and trust and confidence was at a zero, and it had massive impact and traumatized a lot of people. And I wouldn't say it's just because senior leaders went off to university and came back in a different concept. I think it was a lot more accountability and transparency. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act that took over from the sus law made sure that officers had reasonable grounds to stop and search people. There was a lot more checks and balances when people are taken to the station and reviewed while in custody. So I really think that there's definitely a change for the better. All I would say is that the toxic masculinity in the culture of the police service has taken over, and it's starting to get more heavy-handed.
Let's put that to Peter. Peter, the problem with the police service or police force these days is toxic masculinity.
one of the huge problems with the current police service is that the D word has become a dirty word. And by that, I mean discipline. Supervision, management, training, vetting, recruiting are all appalling. But in the name of becoming a fluffier leadership and being more woke and really hip and down with the kids, unfortunately, what has happened is that discipline has been lost. In a disciplined environment, a disciplined workplace, bad people will be rooted out, found out and booted out.
Peter Bleksley and Leroy Logan, thank you both very much. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, to go to our channel on YouTube, just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.